welcome to Consider the Sources, or House Over-mantel Painting. I'm Stacy Loveland. Today we are live from the Benjamin Powell House to talk about how a rare landscape painting from an overmantel in the Hugh Orr House, formerly the George Reed House, is being studied at Colonial Williamsburg. We'll get to your questions very soon, so please post them in the comments. But before we do that, let's introduce the team here today to tell us more about this project. With us are Shelley Svoboda, Senior Conservator of Paintings, and Jennifer Wilkowski, Shirley and Richard Roberts Architectural Historian. Can you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Well, I've worked with the foundation now for 19 years, and in the capacity as Senior Conservator of Paintings, I both manage the Painting Conservation Lab and care for the paintings collection. I work with a preventive team, first with setting the stage with having the best long-term preservation of the collection pieces by ensuring proper environment, stable temperatures and humidities, and proper light levels. In the event that a painting might need treatment, that's something that I would undertake too. It's been an honor working with the collection for these years.
Well, you do fantastic work. We're thrilled you're here.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen. I am an architectural historian, and I work with the Department of Architectural Preservation and Research. And basically, I study buildings for a living. So anytime that we are kind of tasked with better understanding buildings or undergoing restoration or reconstruction, and we also do preventative maintenance, work with that. That's stuff our department works with every day.
Excellent. Well, we certainly have a lot of buildings for you to keep up on. Well, thank you both so much for being here. I am thrilled you're able to join us. I know that we're going to have a great conversation. Colonial Williamsburg is always looking at things new, and this painted overmantel and the house it's in are a perfect example. So, Jen, can you start by just telling us about the Orr House name change, since some of our viewers might know it as something else?
Sure. So for many years, the house has actually been known as the George Reed House. And we've named houses in the past based on who lived there. And obviously over the 18th century, there are multiple owners. And at one point, we felt that the house maybe had been torn down by George Reed and rebuilt around the 1790s. And so that's why his name was on the house. But now that we're doing further investigation, we're looking back at other research, documents, archaeology, and actually even cutting into the building itself to look for like little pieces of the past. We are now confident that this building is actually much older than we were expecting. And so we've placed the name as the Hugh Orr House because he was the longest living 18th century resident of the house.
That's amazing when we get to discover new things that we thought we already understood. So that's fantastic to have new insight on that. And then, Shelley, we have some more new insights. Can you tell us about how the landscape painting itself is an ongoing study we're currently involved in and learning more about?
Sure, it's a fascinating team project that I'm thrilled to be a part of. And the curators initially brought some questions forward, curious things about this particular painting. Do both castles belong? Was it painted while it was installed over the mantel? And so we've explored some of these questions with our tools and have come to a number of conclusions and are working forward with some ongoing investigations too.
Awesome. And in just a second, we're going to get to dig more into that. But I want to take a moment first to find out more about the Hugh Orr House itself, where the overmantel painting was originally installed.
We're standing in the west room of the George Reed House, which we are now calling the Orr House.
The investigations into this house, the architectural investigations that we're doing, were actually started by interest in an overmantel painting, which in fact is the only surviving 18th century overmantel painting from Williamsburg that we know of. It was above the fireplace in the west room in this building.
This room probably would have been a parlor. That's something we're still trying to figure out. We are actively investigating this space.
This is the type of room where you would have wanted to impress people. And that's probably why we had a beautiful chimney piece, an overmantel, and also a painting here in this room.
We set about trying to find more information about this special painting, and the irony of the project is that we ended up finding out more about the house than the painting itself.
It had so many questions. Why was it in this type of house? Who painted it? When was it painted? So in looking into trying to date it and figure it out, that led us into, well, why this house? So let's start looking into the house. Let's start looking into the history of it, which meant archaeologically, architecturally, historically, the people who lived in it. And it really opened up a lot of questions, and that's what we're searching for today.
Projects like these are all-encompassing. They're one foundation projects that tend to involve a variety of specialists across the foundation. We bring in specialist conservators, preservationists, curators, to try and answer the questions at hand.
We are actively investigating, so that means opening little investigation units in the walls, sort of like an archaeologist would do in the ground. And that means removing plaster so we can look at the framing or the bones of the house. One thing that we're looking at while we kind of investigate and research this house is how it evolved over time. And we know from the framing and the construction techniques that this room was enlarged sometime in the 18th century. And then it was upgraded again in the early 19th century. And we know this from stylistic features, such as the molding profiles, but also from paint analysis. And all of those things together can help us understand what this room was used for and what it looked like in the period.
The subject matter of the signboard is Scottish. It most likely depicts a Scottish landscape. We know that Hugh Orr was from Scotland, and most likely he probably commissioned a local artist to paint a scene that he was familiar with. A lot of Overmantel paintings depict landscapes, their particular buildings or towns. They often are inspired by particular print sources, but design sources can also come from building books, they can come from embroideries, wallpaper, any number of sources. We know that Hugh Orr in his inventory had paintings and prints. Unfortunately, we don't know the subjects of those. He also had a sizable library of about 40 books, and I can't help imagine that there wouldn't have been one or two volumes that were about Scotland, and it could very well be that one of those books contained a print that was the inspiration for our design today.
We looked at Hugh Orr's inventory when he died in 1764, and it mentioned 11 beds with furniture. It mentioned lots of tables, lots of chairs, lots of belongings, lots of gilt-framed pictures and large maps and even a small library.
He owned objects that we would normally have expected for a blacksmith to own. He had really high-end furnishings for his house. He had really, really nice ceramics, glass pyramids, you know, things that you wouldn't have thought of a tradesperson owning. I wanted to know why somebody like Hugh Orr might have had these types of furnishings. We looked at the deed of the house and how it traveled over time and who got the property and when. And right before Hugh Orr acquired the house, Edward Bairdell had it, and he was an attorney and very well known and very wealthy. And I think what happened was that Edward and Hugh knew each other somehow, and what ended up happening is during Edward Bairdell's estate and how it was being settled, a lot of that transferred to Hugh Orr. So we have documents that prove that the house and the contents transferred from Edward Bairdell to Hugh Orr, and I think that kind of cleared up a little bit of mystery for me when I was looking at the primary source documents.
Welcome back. Shelley and Jennifer are ready to answer your questions, so please post them in the comments. We want to know what you're wondering about. The house and Overmantel here are just so integrated, it's hard to study just one of them without the other. So to talk more about both of them together, let's get started with a question from our audience. Right off the bat, Nicole wants to know, how do you begin studying this piece? How do you study a piece like this?
Oh, that's a great question. With any treatment that is brought to us, questions from the curator often initiate. If we need to exhibit something or loan something, we undertake our professional documentation, both written and photographic format, and then begin using the different tools to inform those. X-rays if we need to, infrared photography, and of course our surface microscope, that is our workhorse tool. With this project, we particularly found the X-rays helpful, the infrared photography, and our cross-sections. So it's been data coming from these different tools feeding into our reports that then help us answer our curators' questions.
That's awesome. That's a a lot of research and a lot of science going into learning more about it. But as fascinating as all that is, as we said, it's not just the overmantel piece, it's everything that goes with it. It's the house and the person who lived there. And Latoya is asking us, can you tell us more about Hugh Orr, the person who is, as far as we know, living with this painting?
Sure. Hugh Orr was Scottish. He comes to Williamsburg. We think he purchases the house around 1740. He's actually very interesting because we think he's a blacksmith. He's actually buried at Bruton Parish Church.
And that's right down the street from his house.
Exactly. And his tombstone actually calls him the Hammerman of Williamsburg, which, again, that gives you a little information. But we actually look more into Hugh Orr. We have his inventory. So when he passes away in the 1760s, they do a probate inventory. That means they just go through his house. They mark down all of his belongings. That way, if there's any debtors or if he has any loans that he needs, out there that they have to take from the estate. So we have that document actually, and it lists all kinds of interesting things. And so that's one way we can understand Hugh Orr, and the other way is to actually look at the building itself, which is one of the processes that we're working on right now.
Excellent. We have a great question coming in from Lori about another resident of the house, or at least someone else who lived on the property. As we said, we had been calling it the Reed House because of a later person to live on this site. Lori wants to know if the Reed that owned this home was related or connected to the Reed that signed the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, that's a good question, and one that I actually don't know the answer to. So that's something we can look up and kind of post later and figure that out.
That's one of the wonderful things about sites like this is there's so much we always get to learn and research new things. So thanks for asking, Lori. We'll hopefully find an answer. Christine is asking us, why was the painting removed from the fireplace? I mean, it's not there anymore.
Good question. We know that it was removed in the 1980s, and the reasons weren't really documented, but it's clear now that our smaller buildings, like the Orr House, have a difficult time maintaining environments that are really what we need for the best long-term preservation of the collection. So we had seen a little bit of splitting, and I suspect that a better environment was deemed the goal there.
You can say it. Virginia's humid.
Yes.
Well, I'm glad it's been able to be taken somewhere that it can be in a stable, less humid environment. And it's not just the weather and the air and the temperature, though, is it? There was something else that presented potential danger to it, wasn't there?
Well, anything over the mantle certainly is wide open for soot deposits, which we really don't encourage. So it was fairly disfigured with a notable amount of soot when it was over the mantle, which it doesn't get exposed to at this point.
So you really had your work cut out for you. Stabilizing, cleaning, understanding it, but I'm glad you were able to do that. Now, Michael is asking, do you believe that the painting was done on site at the house or in a shop and then installed in the house?
Very good question, and that was one of the curator's questions too. We were able to really look over the surface carefully with our surface microscope in the lab and see that the edges of the paint were disturbed in a way that told us the painting was still wet, or at least plastic, when it was put into its position over the mantle. We know it wasn't painted over the mantle because of that same evidence. So it seems that it was painted locally. I don't believe we have much information about a shop that might have been present or not, or what type of environment it really would have been painted in. There isn't a lot of documentation about how the earliest painters in Williamsburg actually painted. So it would be a little speculative on our part, but we do know that it was painted most likely locally and then installed over the mantle.
That's amazing that just slightly bumpy paint can tell us where something was painted. That's fantastic. That's really cool to know. Donovan is asking us just how common these sorts of over-mantel paintings were. Was there a specific period in which they were fashionable? Is this an example of that? Or?
Well, if we think about the history of homes, heating was, up until a certain point, a fireplace. And the fireplace was a prominent element of a home, as our curators were just saying. And it was an opportunity to really have a centerpiece of decorative kind of status symbol. So we know that they exist, and yet they were really only present for a small minority of people, the civic leaders or people that had a lot of means. So, but overmantels were certainly a part of that history throughout a broad swath of time, even though they were rare during that broad period.
Well, I'm excited we get to see one in a
Yes.
house on Duke of Gloucester Street then. That's very exciting. And Liz is asking then, since we know this is not the only one in existence, are there other overmantel paintings at Colonial Williamsburg or elsewhere in Virginia for people who think this one's amazing and want to
Yeah.
see more?
Yeah, well, we're very fortunate at Colonial Williamsburg to have the Carolina Room, which is an entire room from South Central North Carolina, decoratively painted in 1836, signed and dated. It has an overmantel picture that you see here that is of the fire of New York City, which happened a year or two, if I remember correctly, before this room was painted. So this room was salvaged from a home that was in near falling down condition and brought up here and installed recently with the reopening of the Folk Art Museum. So we took advantage of that opportunity to undertake major conservation work. In addition, I think overmantel paintings are a little more common in the 19th century, but going back to other examples in Virginia in the 18th century, they're fairly rare. But there's a fabulous overmantel at Mount Vernon that is well documented as having been brought over from London at the request of George Washington. It's a landscape, a beautiful landscape, dated to about 1757, I believe, circa 1757. And it's a canvas panel, a canvas painting, unlike the overmantel that we've been studying, which has yellow pine panels as its support. And in this case, we were so fortunate to, while they needed to have the painting deinstalled for work on the house, they brought the painting down for us to study in our labs here. So we were able to undertake an X-ray and really look into the layers with that technology. And we were able to see that this was actually an example of a reused canvas. There's clearly a portrait of a fairly completed female portrait underneath it that has unfortunately been repurposed with cutting through at the top and the bottom to change it into a landscape. And painting at that point in England was a commodity, and for some reason that portrait became undesirable, but the canvas itself remained very valuable. So it was, as a material, still valuable and was reused.
That's fascinating to see another overmantel piece in Virginia also having something painted over, just like the one here does. That's
Yes.
really cool, those similarities. Now, Sam is asking us about the painting we have at the Orr House here in Williamsburg, about how long the painting was in the house. And I'm going to follow up with, how long was it in the house, and how do we know that? How do we get the dates that we have?
That's a tricky question. Well, as any house that people live in, it changes over time. So we are seeing changes to the house, from the 18th century to the 19th century. So I will say that the room that it was located in had changed a bit over time. But Shelley could probably talk a little bit more about how we know the date of the painting itself.
The painting would have been removed from the house in the 1980s, I believe it was. We really don't know the beginning date, so it's hard to make a hard estimate on this, but sometime in the 18th century it would have been installed. So that's your time frame, basically your span of a number of years. And it's clear that it was at one point moved from the original 18th century framing elements into a 19th century set of framing elements, though it still remained in the house. So we have a beginning point sometime in the 18th century and an ending point in 1980s.
Wow. So the short answer is like about 200 years, maybe more. The long answer is we can't wait for more data, right?
And it could be more than that. It could be quite a bit more than that.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I am so glad you all are sending in such great questions. I'm really enjoying our conversation. But I want to give us a chance to learn more about the landscape painting. And remember, if the video we're about to watch or anything else brings up more questions, please post them in the comments.
So overmantels were wooden elements that were applied to fireplaces to help really elevate a space and really make the room come together architecturally. So when you visited Huor, you would have been brought into this room possibly to sit and to be entertained by them. And you would have noticed this huge painting above the chimney.
This is the only known painting that was made for one of our historic sites. It's a really luminous landscape painting. The foreground has what are possibly fishermen coming in after their day's done. There's a rising landmass that has a small castle sitting on top of it. It's a really dynamic composition, one that has a lot of stories on a human level going on, and also a very pleasing formal composition in contrast and color. While we have in the final version a smaller castle perched up on the hill, a careful look reveals a crackle pattern that seems to indicate there's a sizable castle below the surface layers. Both of these seem to be in the same style, just on a different scale. The lower paint layers that it was rendered in, often dark paints, were slower in drying. The upper layers were faster in drying, and they actually pulled open along the dark lines of the castle details underneath to create almost a sketch of the larger, earlier castle.
We don't actually know for certain who exactly ordered this, commissioned the painting to happen, and what year it went in. That's something that we're still discovering, and many of my colleagues, especially in our paintings conservation lab, are trying to figure out.
The techniques that I used to analyze the samples from this painting included cross-section microscopy. That's where we're mounting small chips or fragments of paint in a clear cube of resin and essentially looking at its cross-section under high-power microscopy. We did spend a day doing some portable XRF of the painting where we're able to use X-ray energy to target spots in the painting, different colors particularly, to look at their elemental content. And in that way, we can understand the pigment composition in those areas. So for instance, there's a figure in the foreground with a red garment on, and that area was positive for mercury and sulfur, which is indicative of the red pigment vermilion. So far, all of the pigments are consistent with an 18th century painting. Lastly, I did use our scanning electron microscope to look at some of our cross sections. And in the scanning electron microscope, we can see the same layers, but we can target areas in that sample for elemental analysis. So we're zooming in 4,000 or 5,000 times and conducting this targeted analysis on the cross-section itself. And again, everything was consistent with an 18th century date.
Using our surface microscope, we were able to see a very defined lump of paint that went around the entire perimeter that indicated when the framing was put on, the paint was still wet or plastic.
The object was probably still tacky when it was installed. It was something that was made nearby and then installed, not something that was painted in situ. We know it was made with yellow pine. Yellow pine is indigenous to America, so this wasn't something that was made by an English artist and imported, but that we feel comfortable saying that it was made here.
Using the different tools in the lab, we were able to observe that the panels had a series of splits in them, no doubt from earlier centuries in a non-climate controlled environment. To deal with the splits, we are developing custom-made mounts with our mount maker, Jim Armbruster. We're basically putting it into a more respectful mount and framing system for the exhibition at the museum. We were also able, in our initial examination, to observe that there were very small areas of lifting and insecure paint of the image. So in keeping with our approach to minimal less is more and respectful care. Each of the small areas of lifting paint was secured with a local application of reversible conservation adhesive using a small brush and carefully set down so that it is able to stay attached in a more secure way during handling and exhibition.
The analysis was quite complicated and it didn't always give us clear answers. And in many ways, it's still ongoing. This is something that we're going to continue looking at for quite some time.
That was a fascinating look into what examination and study goes into finding out about a painting, especially one as integrated into the architecture as this one is. Now though, since we got to see all that, we have some more audience questions for you guys. Donna is starting us off by asking, what types of paints were used for the paintings so that this ended up being kept in such good condition? What's special about them?
In the 18th century, the majority of easel paintings were made with linseed oil, which is an amazing material pressed from flaxseed. So that wonderful plant gives us both linen and linseed oil that cross-links with time and makes really sturdy paint layers. So, and in the period, the paints would have been hand ground. Pigments of the period had to be mixed by hand before they were put on. So in general, most of the easel paintings or pictures like this would have been bound with a linseed oil.
Awesome. Well, that's very good to know for preservation and how it all works. And it's clear we have people interested in this because Barb is asking us what other types of material were used for the painting and how are they acquired? So beyond linseed oil, what are we seeing? And I know the video mentioned a few chemicals that appear, but where are we getting these colors from in general?
Yes, good questions. And they're questions that I am incredibly curious about and doing ongoing research with a chemist at the college. The period did have regular imports into the area of pigments, and they're documented in the newspapers. And that's something that I've looked into for a number of reasons. So the pigments would have been shipped in with all the commodities that came into the area, and they would have been announced in the newspaper. And typically pigments were listed with apothecary goods, and they were often quite valuable. So early on in the 18th century, I don't believe there was a store built, a brick and mortar store, so people would advertise that they had these things and other people that were interested would have to come and buy them from wherever that person was at the time. In addition, varnishes might have been acquired. We don't see a lot of that quite as much, and other compounds. Now, I'm aware too that paints could come in large quantities ready-made that would have been intended for buildings. Jen, if you're interested in, or making a comment on that.
Sure. So we do have some great documentary evidence in Williamsburg. Actually, the St. George Tucker House, it has a painted red roof on the house. And that was, we found out about that from both paint analysis, so taking samples like you saw in the video, and also through the documentary records. So it's advertised as a red pigment and using fish oil, I think, is the binder for that one.
That sounds right, yeah.
And so paint, is great for the artistic side, but also all the buildings around us are also painted. So that's another big source of paint analysis for us here at Colonial Williamsburg.
That's really cool, being able to have so many uses for something in so many places it could end up. And I love as well that you mentioned how just interconnected all this research is. We need people looking at architecture, people looking at paintings and fine arts, but also people studying written primary sources, looking at what's being imported. So that's really cool to see how you learn about all that.
And I think that I'm seeing with my work both the pigments that we see advertised in the newspapers, they are pretty current with what's new and available in London, of course, because much of our commodities came from England. So we're fairly current with stuff coming in. So once Prussian blue becomes a thing, we see it over here. We see the lake colors coming in, very costly but very sought after, certainly for portrait painting. But we just see everything listed in the newspapers and mimicked or found again as materials in the paintings themselves.
Well, that
or
must
the
help.
walls.
That must help date then paintings and buildings and things like that as well if certain elements don't show up until later, right?
That's right. And it can also work the other way where, for instance, we've found indigo in a number of paintings, which is a surprise. And that tells us that that artist at that time had access to that commodity. So we can inform in, kind of back and forth.
That's amazing. Well, we definitely have people very interested in talking about all this paint, so thank you for being willing to go in so in-depth about it. Susie is now asking us, from the 18th century side of actually doing this, if you were a painter in Williamsburg, is that a trade? And if it is considered a trade, would these painters have had a trade shop or something
It's a great
else?
question, and it's another one that we are so curious about and have ongoing questions and research about. In the 18th century, we know there were very few artists here in the period documented. And we know perhaps the most about William Daring, who did rent or I think he owned the Rush Everard house at one point on the Palace Green. So it's possible that people would have come to his home to be painted. Or we also know that sometimes the artists would go out to the home of a sitter. I don't believe we have any evidence of actually having a studio in the city at that point. And I think we just, as the beginning of our history here, there just wasn't enough demand to supply painters. They often didn't stay very long because it was very difficult to make a living. So a great question, yeah.
That makes sense. Even in a capital city like Williamsburg, where there's a lot of wealth congregated, you can only afford so many pictures. Leslie has asked a great question. Why would someone want an overmantel painting instead of just hanging a framed painting over their fireplace? Are there any ideas about that? What sets these apart?
It's a great question.
I think it's probably partly a status symbol.
Okay.
If you have something that's built into your house, it's a sign of status, and especially for paintings of that era, having any image that's painted is a status symbol.
Yeah. And these are so rare, it's hard to even know, but we can speculate. These panels are tremendous amounts of work to hew them. I mean, there's two panels that are each this tall. So they had to be really big trees that were basically carved down into these panels that were then, shaved, beveled to fit into their frames down to 2 millimeters, just a huge amount of very difficult work. So yeah, I can see that being a super status symbol to be built in. And more of the overmantel paintings I'm familiar with are like the one at Mount Vernon, where they're canvas that has been inset. And even that takes a lot of planning because you got to get it underneath the framing elements over the mantle. So they're all very high level decorative objects.
That's very cool. I didn't even think to ask that, Leslie. Thanks for asking us that today. Now, Marla is asking us, saying, it sounds like consolidation was needed, but was any other treatment undertaken recently in tandem with the research that we're doing? And, since you said the painting was originally removed from the house in the 1980s, was this treated in the 1980s? What happened to it between then and now?
The painting was treated in the 1980s. That is when the soot was removed from it. It was also locally consolidated at that time for ongoing insecure local paint. So it has been an ongoing problem, and we're really hoping with the improved framing that's more respectful of the kind of idiosyncrasies within the unique wooden supports, that with the climate control, it will be arresting the small scale lifting that has been an ongoing problem. But in this case, we didn't do any other treatments except work with the mount maker and the frame modifications to get a more respectful framing undertaken for better future preservation.
Well, I'm glad to hear it had already had so much preservation happening, and you had a lot of other things to look at without having to do that, so I'm glad that was taken care of.
Yeah, it's really been an amazing team effort to work with so many specialists and having a deep technical dive into it.
That's always excellent. Marshall is asking us, how many layers of paint did you discover in looking at this painting and trying to date it when you were looking at it? And since we're talking about dating things as well, this might also extend to the house. So I'd be interested to hear, since both of you looked at paint layers, what your answers are for how many layers of paint you found and what it told you.
Well, within the panels, the cross-section taking has to be very minimal. Even though they're very small, it's still a damaging test. Yeah. So we stay at the edges. And we, in this case, only took 3 cross-sections. And in this case, I had a postgraduate intern, advanced intern, who did the cross-section work. But here you can see examples of the cross-sections. We have a couple of ground layers, and then we have different numbers of areas in different areas of the painting. For instance, in the area of the small castle that we see, the artist's intended visual castle, we no doubt have more layers of paint because it's stacked on top of the earlier huge castle. So each area is going to have a different number of paint layers in it.
That makes sense.
But we do know from looking at the surface of the painting where these drying cracks have opened up, we can see some of the layers of paint in that way too. And it does look like it varies from area to area, but it's certainly not like a wall structure that's been overpainted repeatedly over the years. The picture itself, what we're looking at is the original painting. So we have only the artist's paint here with, maybe 4 paint layers in areas to maybe 10 at the most as he's making his changes with the castle, and the horizon line is also changed a little bit, but he's stacked the changes on top of the earlier layers.
Well, that's fascinating to be able to see so in depth. Jen, what about the house?
Sure.
There's paint in the house that you can get layers from too, right?
Yeah, definitely. So paint analysis is another thing that we use when we're investigating the house. So it helps us understand how the spaces have changed over time. Because just like today, back in the 18th and 19th century, people painted their houses to follow the prevailing trends. And we know this house was actually used as a residence after it was restored. So up until about, like 2 or 3 years ago, it was a residence. And so it was painted quite often by our Colonial Williamsburg maintenance staff. So there was probably upwards of 15 to 20 paint layers.
Wow.
Obviously the early ones, not as many. But we can look at the pigments, we can look at the chemicals that are in the paint, and actually get a really great kind of date range for when things were added or taken away. So that's one thing that we use as well.
I had no idea there were so many layers in the house. Wow, that's amazing. Now, Johnny is asking us a little bit more about the paint. I know, you mentioned different things that kind of help preserve it, like the linseed oil, but he's asking specifically what paint was made with and what it was mixed with. So is it just powdered pigment and linseed oil and you're able to use it, or do you have to add something else to make it liquid enough to make it set? What else is necessary?
When I do a lab tour, that's one of the focuses that I have. And in the 18th century, largely paint for easel paintings was bound by linseed oil that was added by hand to pigments. Okay. So it's very simple, but then those are combined in unique ways by the artist with his brush load. If he's doing a portrait, each paint stroke is a little bit different in how he's mixed it, but the basic beginning point was largely, again for easel paintings, linseed oil plus dry pigments. So we would have earth pigments and lead-based pigments and lakes and Prussian blues, and they would be bound and then they would be applied and mixed by the artists. You could have varnish additives. It's something that was taught in some of the academies, but in the paintings that are in our collection, we don't find a lot of varnish added to the linseed oil in the binders. So it begins as a very simple thing, but it becomes infinitely more complex as each of the mixed by hand bound with linseed oil colors becomes mixed by the artist on his palette and applied to each unique painting.
That makes sense. That's awesome. Thank you. Ross is asking a question that I also would like to know the answer to. Thanks, Ross. Ross wants to know, will this house be open to the public? And I'm going to tack on as well. Will the house be opened, and will we be able to see this Over-mantel painting anywhere too? So when can we see this?
So the house, we're actually actively investigating it right now with the hopes that we will open it. I can't give you a specific date, but I think it will be later this year, periodically opened. And we will take you through and show you what we're investigating, why we're investigating it, how we know what we know, basically, and why architectural historians and how they do their work. So we do hope that you'll visit us later when it is open, and it's going to be very exciting because it's something that it's behind the scenes. So people normally don't get to see the framing, and they normally don't get to see all of these things that we study. So hopefully people will enjoy it.
I can't wait. I'm going to do that on my first research day that it's open, I think. That's excellent.
And
what
I
about the
do
painting?
Well, I think if I might add to Jen's,
Sure.
in the house itself, we're going to have a technical panel that basically pulls all the technical observations in that we know it was painted, and then put in that the castles all belong, et cetera. So the public visitor will be able to see all of that in a nice label form. And then the Over-mantel paintings themselves will be part of an architectural exhibition in the new museum spaces. So that is partially installed now. So soon enough, we will have everything visible in both the museums and the art historic area.
That is so exciting. So when you come and visit, hopefully very soon, you'll be able to see this, hopefully by the end of the year. That is great. I cannot wait myself to see it in person.
It's been a great project.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are almost out of time, but we do have one final question that I want to ask, and this is coming from Sarah. Sarah, this is a great question. Thank you. Sarah is asking, what more do you hope to find out about concerning the painting and the house? What are the other questions you have? What do you hope you can learn?
So for the house itself, it's a bit of a mystery right now. We haven't been able to get a very solid date for when it was built. We have some tools in our toolbox to be able to help us. One is called dendrochronology, and it's when you take a core sample of the timbers that build the house. They can be then analyzed and compared against other sample sizes and kind of dates for when things happen. And give you really specific dates. We've tried this 3 times at the Orr House, and each time has come up inconclusive. So we hope as we keep uncovering things, we'll finally find the kind of timbers that will help us identify the date of the house. And I think just how the building evolved over time would be another thing that we're interested in knowing, because this building seems to have changed quite a bit from the 18th to the 19th century, and learning more about the people that lived in the house as well.
That'd be excellent. And what about for the painting?
Well, there is hope that at some point another tool or something can help us with dating the materials. Again, we have these beautiful panels that can offer some data for helping put the panels into the time frame a little bit more tightly. In addition, it would be tremendous if our historical, our curators could come across a print or something that actually was the source for this composition. Those two things would really add to the puzzle pieces from the house itself. So,
Fingers crossed.
yeah, and we've learned a lot on the path so far. Answered some questions and encountered some new ones.
Yes.
That's one of the great things about history. You can learn so much and then learn how much more you still have to learn. So if any of you have any 18th century documents that you're sitting on in your own house that seem to answer some of these questions, would love to hear about it, because we want to keep learning for sure. The expertise that it takes to research the history of a painting and building are many and varied, as I'm sure you've all been able to see with this today. Thank you, Jennifer and Shelley, and all your colleagues in conservation, curation, and historic architecture for sharing your enthusiasm for this very important work. And thanks for joining us for this fascinating conversation today. This was wonderful. Colonial Williamsburg relies on the generosity of guests and donors just like all of you watching right now. This project today was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We hope that you'll join us on Friday, February 18th, for the live stream of The Anatomy of an Exhibit, where we outline how an exhibit is planned and implemented in the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg. We'll take a peek into the workspaces where design, fabrication, and conservation take place. Experts will tell the story of how it all comes together for you to see at exhibits in person or virtually here at Colonial Williamsburg. And remember, when you're considering history, always consider the sources.